Does anybody have any questions over the stuff you need to know for Chapter 1? So only a couple of highlights there. And incidentally, I brought the final exam itself here so I can check it over and make sure that you all know what you need to know. That thought did cross my mind when I thought of it. What if they attack me? They won't do that. So, alright. So any questions about the Chapter 1 stuff? It's relatively basic, just identifying a pseudoscience, some of the characteristics we talked about way back at the beginning of the semester, and then just having an understanding about what the difference is between these various goals of psychology. So, relatively basic stuff. So, no questions about that stuff? Alright, well. Oh, you got one? Sorry. No.
Explanation, I think it's just experimental research.
Yeah, so that goal is just, that goal of explanation deals with determining what are the cause and effect relationships that exist between the various things that are studied by psychologists. And so that goal is accomplished by doing true experiments that have control groups and things like that, like we've talked about all semester. Any other questions about the Chapter 1 stuff? Alright, so let's take a look at Chapter 2. There's a bit more you need to know from this one. So this was the chapter that was all about ethics in research. So, APA code. Anybody have any questions about that one? How it was formed? How was the APA code formed? Yeah, so the Hobbes Committee tried to get reports of what they called critical incidents from all the psychologists they could sample so that they could get an idea of what people considered to be ethics violations and kind of tabulate those and use them to form the code. Let's see. And you also need to know a lot about Milgram's obedience experiment, all the basics of that. Do you have a question, Josh?
Yeah, I remember on one of the tests you asked us what major ethical guidelines did it violate, and it violated a few. What would you have us know?
So, yeah, alright. Well, so one of the biggest guidelines that, or the ethical things that the Milgram experiment violated was the idea that you shouldn't do anything to your participants that causes any lasting harm or distress. And that was an extraordinarily stressful situation that those people were put into. And they were very, very disturbed by that. And so a modern human subjects committee probably wouldn't approve of something like that because of the extreme amount of anxiety that it would cause to the participants. And so that's probably the biggest hang-up there. I think one answer option on that previous question that people got thrown off by was the idea that they didn't do a debriefing in that study, but they actually did. I may not have talked about it a whole lot in class, but they told people afterwards you weren't really giving electric shocks to these people. They brought out the person so they could see that. So they did do a debriefing, which is important, but they did just cause ridiculous amounts of anxiety to the participants.
With the question what were participants told about the purpose of the study, I think that was on like our last seminar or the first exam. I believe it was what were they exactly told the purpose of the study? I remember the actual purpose of the study, but the participants were told.
So participants in the Milgram study were told that it was a study of the effects of punishment on learning. So that was their cover story, so that they wouldn't really know the true hypothesis, and that it was actually a study to see if they would, how they would respond to authority, if they would actually obey and give people these very high levels of, or believe that they were giving people these very high levels of shocks. So effects of punishment on learning is what they told people they were studying. Anything else about the Milgram study? So, incidentally, if you want to rewatch that video, it's up on YouTube. If you look up Milgram experiment, Darren Brown, he did that recreation that we watched in class. that's really fascinating. I showed it in my intro classes this morning. So then we had the different distinctions between the various levels of risk to participants in psychology experiments. So there was the idea that some studies didn't involve any risk at all. Other studies involve a little bit of risk, but it's nothing beyond what people would face in their daily lives, just mild anxiety or something like that. And then there's the higher risk studies where participants might get really stressed out or disturbed in some way. They're intentionally made to feel anxious, although the idea, again, is that it wouldn't last beyond the end of the study. You'd give them a debriefing that would help them calm down, but still, they'll be at some risk. Do you have a question, Josh?
Yeah, now, you asked to state whether it's certain tasks in an experiment where no risk, no risk are at risk, and then participants were asked to perform daily routines. But that's it, that's all you got. What would you say that was minimal risk?
That's probably minimal risk. Typically, the no-risk studies are those that are like the observational research that we talked about in this most recent unit, where you're not interfering with them at all. It's just like naturalistic observation. And another thing you need to know about that is that, well, there's this next item. How do the levels of risk relate to the different levels of review conducted by an IRB? So there was a question on one of the previous exams about that, and the idea was that if a study is a no-risk study, then a lot of times the IRB will go ahead and complete an expedited review if it's no risk or minimal risk, so they'll kind of rush it through. It won't have to go to the full committee. They'll look over your procedures and say, yeah, there's not much risk, sounds good, go ahead and do it. But they still have to review it to some extent most times. So, any other questions about risk? Y'all know what the purpose of the IRB is? That should be pretty straightforward now. Just making sure that the researchers are doing things according to ethical guidelines. Any other questions about anything for Chapter 2? All right. This Willowbrook and Tuskegee studies, we didn't talk about those in class, but they're in your textbook. I told you to read about them, so make sure you go over that again. All right. So next we've got Chapter 3. Developing ideas for research in psychology. Any questions about the stuff for this unit? Everybody know what a confederate is? What is a confederate? Yeah, it's somebody who's working with the researcher. They're not a participant, but they're somebody who like in the Milgram study, the confederate was the person who was supposedly receiving the shocks. So the participants met that person before, and they thought that this was another participant, but it was really somebody who was working with the experimenter. So that's an example of a confederate. This is going to be an important one. Be able to identify an example of a study that combines qualitative and quantitative research. So you remember, qualitative is more based on describing something. Quantitative is based more in measurement. And so I'll give you an example or a description of some research, and you'll have to determine that it combines those different characteristics, whether it does. Any other questions about this stuff?
Can you give an example of a poor operational definition?
Okay, an example of a poor operational definition. So, if you recall, operational definitions need to be really precise, really specific, so that there's really no ambiguity, and it's very clear how the researcher is defining their dependent and independent variables. So, let me see here. Take a look at how I've got this in the test. know I've got something on that in here. Oh yeah. Okay, there it is. So, essentially, what you'll need to know is that the more detail that is given, the better the operational definition is. So, like if we were going to use if we were looking at examples of operational definitions for sex drive, well, we could do something really specific like the number of sexual partners that someone had. We could say that we were going to measure their increase in heart rate when we expose them to erotic stimuli, or we could say that we're going to just ask them to report their own level of sex drive. And so, of those, the self-report of sex drive, without any details given as to the scale of measurement or anything like that, that would be the least adequate. But a good operational definition provides some sense of scale that would allow the reader to understand exactly how that construct is being measured. So if there's any vagueness or anything that's not entirely clear, that's going to be a bad operational definition. Does everybody remember what converging operations were? Converging operations actually refers more to when you see, well, I think you're on the right track there. When a lot of researchers are using different operational definitions to define some construct, but they all seem to be getting a similar pattern of results. So that's converging operations. It's also called converging evidence. So you might have one researcher that measures aggression using horn honking, another that uses aggression using the amount of salsa that the participants put on a chip that they're going to give to somebody else. And if across all these different operational definitions you're seeing the same patterns of behavior, then that's good evidence, and you can say that you've got converging operations that point to the fact that this is a real phenomenon that's been discovered. So, anything else from Chapter 3? There might be a couple more things on here. Nope, that's on to Chapter 4.
What do you mean by the nature of theory?
You know, that sounds philosophical, doesn't it? Let's see. I basically want you to know, how to define a theory. So I'll give you a bunch of the different aspects of the definition of theory that we talked about in class, and then there will be one thing on the list that is not one of those characteristics, and you'll just need to pick it out. So that's a very detailed expectation for what you'll see for that question.